How's my background noise? Do you hear anything? Okay.
Yeah, how's my microphone? Can you hear me?
Yeah, good.
Okay.
All right, it is noon, so I'm going to get started. My name is Danielle Angeleri, and I'm the executive director of NAMI Northern Illinois, which is an affiliate of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, dedicated to building better lives for people and families touched by mental illness in the Northern Illinois region. I have Warren Boykin here, our program and outreach coordinator, and Lori Poppen, who you'll hear from in a moment. I just want to say thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Lori, for providing this information for us today. Just a couple updates. We do have, we're hosting the Stars of Light on Tuesday of next week, just for a webinar of their new tour show, Morning Vibes with Pam and Sam. I think it'll be a fun one to tune into. And then we are having our community membership meeting on the 14th at 5:30 here at our Murray office, and it will be on grief and loss. So I will follow up with everyone here today in an email afterwards to kind of give you that information how to sign up. But Warren, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Danielle. My name is Warren Boykin, and I am the Program and Outreach Coordinator for NAMI Northern Illinois. And we'd like to welcome you to this webinar on the impact of trauma on culture and behavior. This training includes a brief description of trauma and what happens to our bodies when we experience trauma. We define cultural and historical trauma and discuss some of the impacts of those types of trauma. We also discuss how trauma impacts the brain and what it means to be triggered. Finally, we talk about what it means to adopt a trauma-informed approach. Lori Poppen, our speaker today, is the Director of Mental Health and Wellness in the Northern Region at Brightpoint, formerly the Children's Home and Aid Society. She is an LCPC and has more than 33 years of experience working with children and families. Licensed clinical professional counselor. She currently oversees community and school-based counseling programs, child welfare counseling, and partner abuse intervention programming. Lori is trained in the ARC, Attachment, Regulation, and Competency Framework, and is a trauma trainer for her agency as well through the Winnebago County Trauma Informed Community Initiative. I'd like to just remind people that during our webinar, you can put questions into the Q&A function of your screen, and we will take your questions and forward them to Lori as we go. So I think the chat will be disabled. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Lori.
Thank you, Warren and Danielle. And thanks for having me today to speak. So this training is something that we developed as part of the Trauma Informed Community Initiative through the Winnebago County Winnebago County Health Department. Sorry, got all my acronyms mixed up there for a minute. And so we worked with ICOI to create some trainings that can be presented in the community. So this one is sort of a follow-up to like our initial Trauma 101 training that we do. So it goes a little bit deeper into, how trauma impacts people. And I'm not sure, I'm sure everyone here has probably, gotten some information on trauma, and some people probably know a lot more about it than others. So hopefully you'll get something out of it that something that you didn't know before. So Warren did a great job introducing me. Yeah, I've been with Brightpoint, which was formerly Children's Home and Aid. It'll be 34 years in January. And I've had a lot of different roles there. And in the last, 7, 8, 9 years, somewhere in there, I've been in the role of director. And I work with a lot of different community programs and agencies. So this is just sort of one of those collaborations that I've been doing through the health department. And I wish we had time for me to get introduced to everybody that's on the call. But we would probably be here much past the 1 hour time frame. So just some objectives for the training today, kind of a brief overview of trauma, discussing historical and cultural trauma. And I do want to make a little disclaimer that I'm not an expert in historical and cultural trauma. We talk about it, we define it. Excuse me, we talk about some ways to possibly heal from it, but it's not an area that I'm an expert in. We will review how trauma impacts the brain and then talk about what adopting a trauma-informed approach might look like, either in your life, in your work, in our community. So kind of what, what might that look like, and what might be the implications if we don't adopt a trauma-informed approach. Always want to start any kind of discussion about trauma with a self-care warning. If something that we talk about triggers you, to encourage you to pay attention, to how you're feeling, to take a break, do something to take care of yourself. Think of a person that you can connect with after the training if you need to. Just want to make sure that we acknowledge this, that sometimes talking about trauma can be traumatic and it can be triggering, and just want everyone to be aware and pay attention to how you're feeling. So this is kind of the brief, just introduction to trauma. It's, it can be a lot of different things. We have described it using large T and small t. So, there are things that you hear about and that they are, traumatic as soon as you hear about them. There are other things that are maybe more chronic or low grade that can be equally as traumatic for people. So just making sure that we're, kind of all talking about the same thing when we use the word trauma. It's an emotional response to something terrible that's happened. And that terrible thing is very individual. So it can be something that's terrible for me, might not be terrible for, someone else who's involved in the exact same thing. It's a normal reaction to an abnormal event. Shock and denial are often something that happens. Longer term impact, including flashbacks and, changes in sleep and eating, physical symptoms. And that although these things are normal, having these kinds of reactions to traumatic events may be normal. Sometimes, that long-term coping can be difficult. So what happens when we experience a traumatic event? We could go into, an automatic kind of survival response, which many of you have probably heard of: fight, flight, or freeze. Submit is one that's kind of newer to the discussion, and it kind of means what it sounds like it means, just that someone submits in order to kind of get through an event, to make sure that they're safe. They kind of go along with, whatever's happening. So there's, some examples of what that might look like, but just, knowing that this never doesn't always look the same for each person. Sometimes when you believe that you're in danger, or you perceive a dangerous thing, these responses get activated, and then we kind of go into this mode of just really protecting ourselves. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in some future slides. So what happens when we experience a traumatic event, especially if it's prolonged exposure to trauma or it's repetitive? Our natural alarm system might alter, so we don't necessarily have access to some of the, the thinking brain parts of our brain, being able to really make decisions and plan and act. All of those things sometimes aren't as available to us. We go straight into sort of that alarm system, fight, flight, or freeze. We might have sort of a numbing kind of effect where we avoid any sort of, interactions or anything that reminds us of the trauma. We may not feel safe anymore, even in situations where we, would have felt safe before, we no longer do. And we sometimes have trouble trusting others. So now just going to talk a little bit about about historical and cultural trauma. Again, just the disclaimer that this is not an area of expertise for me, but it's certainly something that we want to share information about and have discussion whenever possible around historical and cultural trauma. So, some other terms that you might hear, multi-generational trauma, racial or cultural traumas. And, some of the behaviors that we might see as a result of multi-generational trauma could include like risk of self-harm, addiction, attachment issues. There are also biological impacts of cultural and historical trauma. Trauma can, change, cause chemical changes in our DNA. And then kind of the combination of the behaviors associated with it and the chemical, biological changes kind of helps explain how it goes from one generation to another. In addition to, stories that, that you hear through relatives and people in generations above you where you hear the stories of the traumas that they've experienced. So we know that children of survivors can exhibit many of the same symptoms of trauma and grief that the survivors experienced. So we know that this is a real thing, and we know that there's many different ways that it shows up in our current world. So some features of trauma response that are related to historical and cultural trauma: survivor guilt, depression, PTSD symptoms, sort of anger, which I think we see evidence of that, identifying with the victims, dissociation, poor affect tolerance, preoccupation with the trauma and with death. Some of these slides are a little hard to read, maybe because of the color of the slide, so I apologize for that. But just giving you some examples of ways that historical and cultural trauma shows up, in current times, even though many of the things that might be causing the trauma may have happened, a long time ago. So thinking about historical and cultural trauma, we won't do an actual discussion because of the webinar structure, but just thinking either in your life or in your area of work, what kinds of examples you've seen of historical or cultural trauma, and how do you think that the experiences, impact a person, or, may have impacted people, previously, but now you're seeing it like in a family member. And to think about how trauma is passed through generations. Talked a little bit about how, the sharing of stories, the changes in biology, behaviors that, get witnessed and sort of repeated. So just think about those things. And if you, are in a situation where you want to have a discussion, kind of consider these questions as maybe some opening things for discussion around historical and cultural trauma. So healing historical trauma, I think that we talk about trauma a lot. I know that there are a lot of trainings and a lot of discussions around trauma. Um, and it seems like the conversations are now shifting more toward healing centered conversations. It is important to understand trauma and to know kind of, how it impacts us, and to hopefully have an understanding of, why it happened, or how we're being affected currently. But um, many of the conversations now are moving toward discussions around healing. And I think that this is especially important when we're talking about historical and cultural trauma. How do we help people heal from that? And how do we help people not continue to be re-traumatized? So confronting the trauma and embracing history is one way. Understanding the trauma. So, a little bit of like what we were talking, or what I was saying before about, how behaviors and biology and storytelling kind of help the trauma pass down. Just sort of having an understanding of that, and how it, how that has through the years kind of resulted in, some of the behaviors and things that we see today. Releasing the pain. So, whether that's through direct, service intervention, through therapy or counseling, through, if it's through, community building, and being, um, having, you know, resources available in the community, and then transcending the trauma. So how do we get to a place where, we understand, and we honor, the past, but that we're not, living currently with the pain, and having, all of the symptoms and behaviors that go with that. It really is my belief that service providers, should provide trauma-informed support and intervention, but that we need to be able to, acknowledge and respect the cultural values and practices of the people who are receiving services. So I think it's important within, service provision to keep that in mind. So, going to talk a little bit about trauma and the brain. I am not sure if this is going to play, so this was something I should have practiced beforehand, and I didn't. So hopefully when I play this, you will be able to hear it. Warren, can you give me a thumbs up?
Hey, welcome back, everyone. Today I want to talk about the Incredible Hulk, and why I use the Incredible Hulk metaphor for nearly all my patients with trauma. Because it's one of the best metaphors for understanding how trauma impacts the brain, how we think, how we feel, and how we react to different situations. And it also has some clues about how to actually help people recover from trauma. So everyone knows that the Incredible Hulk is one of America's favorite superheroes. Did you know that he actually has a severe history of childhood abuse at the hands of his father? And so Bruce Banner always had this huge capacity for rage as a way to protect himself from perceived threat. But then when he got infected with gamma radiations, it turned this rage into one of the most powerful forces in the universe. And we all know that as he starts to get angry, his eyes turn green, his skin turns green, and he starts to grow muscles at an incredible rate. But as his Hulk starts to come up, his capacity for intelligence goes way down. And as the Hulk is raging, there's this underlying sense of self-hatred, because Banner hates turning into the Hulk. The rest of the world tries to stop the Hulk by sending the world's military against him, but every time you shoot the Hulk or threaten him, it just makes him absorb more gamma radiation, become stronger and stronger, and probably less and less smart. And the only thing that can help the Hulk calm down is actually to just be done with his rage, destroy the threat, and then go jump to South America or some other beautiful place, and take a nap for a day and a half, and then wake up and realize that you've tattered your clothes and you probably left a wake of destruction. You need to find your way back to civilization. Now, there's a really important lesson about managing kids who Hulk out too. The thing that the world usually does whenever they see a child acting out and hulking out is that they threaten consequences to them. And this is exactly like shooting the Hulk with military weapons. I mean, the more you shoot at the Hulk, you just make him stronger and stronger and madder and madder. And this is what happens to all these kids who are raging out. Everyone sends them to timeouts or threatens consequences and takes away privileges. And it just makes them escalate more and more. And then we end up classifying them as the problem, as having rage and anger issues, when in fact, they just have this overreactive alarm system that operates just like the way that the Hulk does. And so you're going to ask, okay, then what do we do with the Hulk? Now, the first thing you have to do is actually to never let the Hulk come out in the first place. And the way you do that is by strengthening Banner's capacity for self-awareness, to know what triggers him and to recognize when he's starting to get mad. Because when his eyes are green, maybe there's a little bit of capacity for controlling that reaction to become full-blown Hulk. And you also try to help give Banner other skills for dealing with anger and aggression. But at the same time, Banner sometimes needs the Hulk because there are real threats out there. So you can't really hate the Hulk when he comes out. You just have to know when to use him. And then when the Hulk is out, there's really not much you can do. And even for traumatized people, as soon as the sympathetic nervous system is activated and the whole stress response is activated, it's going to take a good 45 minutes to an hour for the body to metabolize all of that adrenaline that's coursing through the body. This is why I like chill out spaces for schools, just a place where kids can go and feel safe and try to calm themselves back down. Now, the other thing you can do when Banner's eyes are green and he still has some capacity to think is to make him focus on what really matters most in this moment. And particularly if you make him focus on who matters most to you, who do you love, what do you care about most in this world, then sometimes it can help de-escalate him down from turning into the Hulk completely. So I hope that helps. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Thank you.
So I really like that video. We've used it a lot, especially in conversations with people who work with children. I think that, it's especially important, the part in the video where he talks about consequences. And I think that, the traditional way of, dealing with misbehavior or, things that are difficult, for kids, has been consequences, and obviously we want kids to be safe and we need to, make sure that that happens. But the traditional consequences don't really work well with kids who are triggered or who are going through some sort of trauma response. So I think a lot of schools in our area have adopted chill spaces, comfort corners, those kinds of things, and have had some really good results using those. So just want to kind of throw that out there after the video, that there's a lot of good stuff in that video, but I particularly like that information from it. So some of this we talked about just a little bit ago in one of the earlier slides, but when someone has experienced trauma or is triggered by something traumatic in their past, the pathways that we use, that our brain uses to get to help us respond can sometimes get rerouted, and we use the pathways, that have been formed in response to trauma. So that is why sometimes we see people, having sort of extreme trauma responses when there's not any, current trauma apparent. And it really is because, their brain kind of gets rewired, and the new pathways are, reacting as if there's always danger present, and that when we are, we're seeing it from the outside, it may not make a lot of sense, but in that person's world, they're protecting themselves. This is an example of a PET scan, I believe, of the brains of a healthy 8-year-old boy and then a brain of a boy who was raised in a Romanian orphanage. And I think it's just a good example of, sort of evidence of the impact that trauma has on the brain. The colorful areas are where there's lots of activity, and you can see in the brain on the right that there's a lot less color, a lot less activity going on. And so, we know that that impacts people in a lot of ways, that their behavior may be different, their ability to concentrate, to do well in school, all of those things are impacted. And we can say that there's evidence, but it's still something that there's not always a lot of understanding about. I've mentioned triggers a couple of times, and just a definition of a trigger is that there's a signal that there's something dangerous in the environment right now. It's usually based on, something that happened in the past. So, you hear something or you see something, smell something, taste something, all of the senses can come into play when a trigger happens. It may or may not mean that there is actual danger present, but there could be. It's a biological signal that, alerts the body that there's something in the environment. And we use it, it shifts us into sort of a self-protect mode when we're triggered. And it kind of, some of those pathways that, I talked about just a minute ago in our brain, when we're triggered, then we often, kind of go right into that fight, flight, or freeze mode, in order to protect ourselves. Here are some things that might cause a trigger. I'm sure, many of us have probably, been triggered by these things. I think sometimes some triggers might be even cultural, that loud noises sometimes in some cultures, or loud voices anyway, are more of the norm. And in other cultures, loud noises or loud voices are not normal. And so, those, just keeping in mind that cultural factors can impact what might be triggering. And it also is sort of a filter that we look through things, through our cultural lens. So something that, might be considered, a trauma symptom in one culture might not be in another. So some additional impacts on the body from trauma, hyperarousal, heart rate, blood pressure, your muscles may be sore or tight, digestion, so eating can be a problem, blood sugar, headaches. So a lot of physical symptoms that we experience when we have trauma, but also long-term impacts. And most of you have probably heard of the ACEs study, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences. And if you haven't heard of it or don't know much about it, it's a really good thing to look into and to learn more about, because there's a lot of information in there about, sort of the long-term impact. So just want to talk a little bit also about sort of vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, lots of different terms that are thrown out. And it's something that we see a lot for people who work in helping professions. But it's also something, that, if you have a family member who's experienced a lot of trauma, or if a good friend, that relies on you, to talk about trauma or process trauma. So it doesn't have to be something that's just for, people in helping professions. It can be really anyone can experience some of these things. So burnout, is really kind of a state of psychological and physical exhaustion. It results from prolonged exposure to trauma, hearing about trauma, either in a work environment or, in your personal life. It includes kind of a progressive loss of energy, aren't really able to, kind of set goals for yourself. And then, being under sort of personal or work stress. Those things are all associated with burnout. Compassion fatigue. A person might, not have the ability to, be empathetic with others, kind of become desensitized to the trauma of others, and may have, a lesser ability to experience joy and happiness, once compassion fatigue sets in. And then vicarious trauma is sort of the cumulative, result of, sort of being empathetic all the time, and listening to people's trauma stories, and, being exposed to their behaviors and symptoms. So many people who experience vicarious trauma may have the symptoms very similar to the people who are have been through the actual trauma. So it's not it's a little different in terms of the definition from some of the others, because with vicarious trauma it really is kind of taking on some of those symptoms and behaviors of the trauma that you've been listening to or hearing about. So kind of moving on to talking about a trauma-informed approach. So it means, that a program or an organization or a system, kind of we're going in now to like the 4 R's of, kind of a trauma-informed approach. But so it's, realizing, recognizing, responding, and resisting re-traumatization, which I will kind of define a little more in this slide. So the realization, and that's, doing trainings, reading about, how trauma impacts people, really just sort of having that understanding of the impact of trauma and, what it looks like. So then being able to recognize it in others. So if you work in the helping profession, I know that we worked with a hospital many years ago to write a grant connected to trauma. And, that it was a really interesting opportunity to sort of share, different experiences like from the social service world versus like a hospital setting. And, having the understanding that really most of the time when people come into the hospital, they've experienced some sort of trauma. There's, the physical part of that, but then just, being in a situation where you need to be in the hospital is also just pretty traumatic. And so, through that work, really helping medical staff recognize what some of the signs of like the psychological piece of it would be. I mean, we know that they're there to address the medical side of it, but being able to recognize how trauma is impacting the people that come into the hospital is a really important thing, because on to the next R, which is responds, that the way that they respond can make a big difference in how someone is able to heal, because continuing to be traumatized excuse me, is not going to be good on their healing journey. So figuring out how to respond to trauma, sometimes, we can't be prepared for everything, but, having an approach or having a framework that you use. Warren mentioned in my initial introduction that I'm trained in the ARC model, which is attachment, regulation, and competency. And so that's a framework that we use at our agency. And it does guide how we respond to trauma. And then I think the final and maybe most important R in the trauma-informed approach is resisting re-traumatization. So, the response piece is a big part of that, but also having having that be something that you are actively doing, as resisting re-traumatization is something that can hopefully help heal. When we were talking about historical and cultural trauma, resisting re-traumatization in those examples is very, very important. And I think that this is all of this information is from SAMHSA, so that's also a really good resource if you want to learn more about this. Going to SAMHSA's website, there's lots and lots of information and resources there. So 6 keys to having a trauma-informed approach: establishing safety, trustworthy and transparency, peer support, collaboration, empowerment, cultural and historical gender issues, making sure that those are acknowledged. We think of, looking at these examples when we, moved into a new building, when our agency moved, I don't know, 6-ish years ago. Looking at the physical space was something that we really tried to take into account. How might, our building or the area where we were asking people to wait, how might that possibly trigger someone, or are people going to feel safe when they come into this building? So there's lots of different pieces of it that you can look at in terms of the lens that you use when you're going for a trauma-informed approach. But and there's a lot to it. You certainly can't predict or plan for everything, but having these as the 6 keys is a really good start. Excuse me. So what would a trauma-informed approach look like in our community? Or, if you work for an agency, or if you're, just interested in, in being part of creating a trauma-informed approach, like, in areas where you interact. Again, some things to talk about would be, physical space. Is it safe? Think about how you usually approach people. Do you approach with a trauma-informed lens? Are you assuming that whoever you're, interacting with has experienced some trauma, and so maybe behaviors or things that people say are a result of that, and so just having kind of that knowledge and approach can often be, a good start. I think that many times when we talk about trauma and connected behaviors, people think that it's an excuse, that many of the, crimes that we see committed, or the things that happen, like in our agency, within the child welfare system, many of the things, that bring people to our agency are connected to past traumas. And we, are always careful to say that it's not an excuse for behavior, but it is an explanation. And if we use the trauma lens and we start to try to help people, towards the healing journey, then maybe changes can happen and there will be, less re-traumatization if we're able to help people understand kind of how they got to where they are now. So just a few takeaway messages, that I think that I mentioned earlier, that trauma really is very individualized. It impacts everyone in a different way, even two people who experience the exact same traumatic event will be, impacted in very different ways. Cultural and historical trauma can have lasting effects. And it's, again, important to look at it on an individual basis, but to also think about some of the things that we talked about that can move toward healing. And then adopting a trauma-informed approach might help, in helping professions. It can help just in people's everyday interactions with, those in our community. As I think I mentioned at the beginning, that I am part of the trauma-informed community initiative through the Winnebago County Health Department. We have a work group that meets monthly to talk about trauma-informed work that's happening. And there are some trainings that are going to be available, I believe, over the next year in conjunction with ICOI. So if you're interested in learning more about those, I believe that if you go to the Winnebago County Health Department website, you can get to the list of trainings that are going to happen. Most of them are virtual and they're all free. So I think some of them, they're very interesting and relevant topics. So I encourage you to look at that. And then here's where you can get some more information about, the trauma-informed community initiative that I talked about, and also some information about the trainings. So that is the end of my training or my discussion. Does anyone have any questions or comments or anything that I can talk more about?
Well, Lori, can you hear me?
I can.
I think we both have frogs in our throat this
Yeah,
second.
I know. I apologize for that. I wasn't expecting it.
Well, one thing I want to remind people that if they do have questions, please type them into the question and answer function on Zoom. It's the Q&A button at the bottom, and I'd be happy to read your questions. But when you were talking about the generational and cultural impacts of trauma, it was interesting that my coworker Jeanette and I were leading a support group at a housing project yesterday, and gentleman came into the group who had been a veteran and who was a veteran, excuse me. But he talked about how he was raised, and he was raised by a father who was very abusive. And he said that his father was abusive because that's how he was raised. And he decided that he would be the opposite of his father, but at times that way that he was raised just popped up in anger, and he would have to catch himself and consciously tell himself, wait a minute, no, I'm not going to do this. So if you go back generations and generations, I think that's how it can be multi-generational, because we're raised by a person and we treat our children the way that we were treated. And
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a really good example of, how it can be a combination of, behaviors. So, he witnessed, he was, the recipient of, his father's parenting and those behaviors. And then also, sort of many generations before, that the DNA, the impact on DNA, throughout the years, all of those things together, right, can lead to, him, even when he's intentionally, wanting to be different, there are, behaviors and things that he's maybe not as able to, control.
I worked many years at the Center for Mental Health at Swedish American Hospital. And I think the most common question that you have when you're working with someone whose behavior is maybe out of control or not what you would expect is, why does this person act like this? And I think that this awareness that it may have something to do with things that happened years and years ago, and that person may be reacting to a situation, as you said, that has triggered them. It could be the way that they're spoken to, or I particularly can relate to that slide that said being told no. And we think, well, that's just normal. We have to set limits. But it may be that in that person's life, when they were told no, it may have been connected to some act of abuse. And so, or they may have never gotten their needs met.
Right. Yeah. And I don't know if it was on the slide in this presentation. I have several trauma presentations that I use sometimes. There's one that talks about some, triggering things. And one of the examples is positive reinforcement, that sometimes for some kids, like a teacher saying something positive them can be a trigger for them. And I think that it's very hard for, adults to understand, that why the child is, reacting in the way that they are. And I think it kind of goes to your other example too, where, you just see behavior, or you see something that just doesn't make sense. And, and in those examples, although sometimes, the teacher is going to have to intervene, and, especially if the child is, going to be harmful to themselves or others. But kind of just having the awareness that really literally anything could be a trigger. I mean, we just don't know all of the things that have happened to every other person and what their triggers are. But just, if you're just sort of always approaching other people believing that they've been triggered for some reason by something, and, maybe just, if it's safe to do so, get curious, about that, have a conversation, about how they're feeling and why. And, just asking questions can sometimes be something that, might help someone sort of calm down and, be able to start accessing those other parts of their brain, rather than the fight, flight, or freeze responses.
Mm-hmm. We have a couple of comments from a participant, Lisa Cohen. Lisa says that she works at an agency called Birth to 5 Illinois Region 4. And it says that their agency has been looking for ways to gain better understanding about how trauma impacts the community that she works with. And she thanks you for the information and says that it's been very informative, and it has. Also, Lisa mentions that the brain development that occurs between 0 and 5 is so important, and unfortunately, negative situations inform this development. It is, for some of us who were fortunate enough to avoid those adverse early childhood experiences, it is a little hard to understand a household where someone very young can experience those negative experiences, but I think it's pretty common and perhaps very common in the community that you work with.
Yes, absolutely. Many of our programs, we work with families, who have young children, and there have been many, traumatic things that have happened, um, you know, to those families, within the families, um, and I think, our trauma informed approach allows us to, understand that the parents probably grew up in a situation with a lot of trauma as well. So, when we kind of come at it from that perspective and we try to help the parents understand, that maybe that's this cycle that they're in, potentially started when they were very young. Um, taking those sorts of approaches, it can be really helpful in helping or in getting people to um, be able to break that cycle.
Here's an interesting comment from Judy in our audience. Judy says, abandonment is a huge trauma at a young age.
Absolutely. Yes, and I think, I kind of just touched earlier on, sort of the big T, little t trauma definitions, and, big T traumas are often those that we hear about, we know that they are traumatic. So, a natural disaster, or, the war that, we currently hear about on television. All of those kinds of things that are immediately recognizable as being traumatic, fall into like the large T trauma definition. And then the small T traumas really are sometimes the things that we can't see. So, abandonment could be one of those things, and neglect. Sometimes things even just like, frequent moves as a child, could be something that might be like a small T trauma for somebody, because and small T definitely doesn't mean impact. I mean, it doesn't mean that the trauma wouldn't impact the person in a big way. So that's not the definition of a small T. It just means that it's not always as recognizable as being traumatic.
I see.
And those are the things that we kind of really want to watch out for, because, a lot of times we pour resources into things that are very recognizable as traumatic. And we reach out and we say, are you okay? I know you've been through this really terrible thing. And, the smaller T examples are ones where sometimes people don't get the support because it's not recognized.
Well, thank you for that explanation and clarification. Another comment from Kira mentions that she has loved all of this today. Thank you for sharing, and so very spot on. So, Lori, I agree. This has been not only very informative, but I think it's very timely. And I think if we think about immigrant populations, people who've been forced to migrate to this country because of situations in their home countries or for economic opportunities, I imagine that can cause quite a bit of trauma, especially with young people. You said moving.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And
absolutely.
it's these are just things that we may just need to be more aware and conscious of. And I saw the slide that talked about empathy. And these are the things that, oh, also that you said it may take time for a person to get their rationality back when they go into these situations where they're hulked out. I love the Hulk out video. I'm a big Marvel Comics fan. And using the Hulk, I think, is a great tool to use with young people, well, people of any age.
Yeah, you can find that video on YouTube if anybody wants to watch it again, or
Mhm.
share it with somebody that you think might, it might be impactful for them. You can find it on YouTube. I think I just search trauma in the Hulk, and it pops up.
Excellent. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left, and I know that some people are on their lunch hours from work. If there are no more questions right now, I want to thank you so much for the time that you've spent with us, Lori, and want to let people know that they'll be able to find a recording of this webinar on our webpage. That's www.naminorthernillinois.org. It may take us a day or two to get it uploaded, but I really appreciate your time, and we thank you so much for your generosity and your information sharing.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed having this discussion and appreciate everybody's time today.
Now, is there can you tell us just one more time a little bit about your organization, and if anyone has any further questions, is there a way they can contact you?
Absolutely. Yes, I work for Brightpoint, formerly Children's Home and Aid. We have a lot of different kinds of programs. I know I've talked a couple of times today about the child welfare programs. That I don't actually have a lot of responsibility related to the child welfare programs, other than some of the counseling that we do for the children and families. Mostly I'm responsible for our community-based counseling. We work in some of the schools. We have adoption support and preservation program, which works with families who've adopted or who have subsidized guardianship. We also have the crisis nursery, which I think most people will have heard of. Mother House. They are more recently going by the Rockford Crisis Nursery rather than Mother House. The name Mother House seemed to confuse some people, and it didn't seem as welcoming for fathers. So they decided to kind of change their brand and are going by Rockford Crisis Nursery, but it's still, still the same services as when it was Mother House, crisis childcare for kids under the age of 7. So yeah, we have a lot of different kinds of programs. We're a statewide agency, so we have programming in the Chicago area, in the Bloomington area, and in Southern Illinois, kind of metro East St. Louis area. But if anyone wants to reach out to me, has additional questions, or anything related to the information today, absolutely, you can reach me at Brightpoint. My email is lpoppen, which is POPPEN @brightpoint.org. And I can share that. I know Danielle has my email, so she's welcome to share it with anybody if they have questions. Or you can call our agency at 815-962-1043, and they'll get a message to me.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much again, Lori. And also, Danielle and I can be reached at NamiNorthernIllinois.org. That's Warren at NamiNorthernIllinois.org. And Danielle is at Danielle at NamiNorthernIllinois.org. Just check out our webpage if you would like to find more information, or email us if you have further questions. Thank you so much again, Lori, for your time.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, stay tuned in the future for more Leading the Conversation webinars. Generally speaking, they'll be on the Thursday of the month. So take care.